Hi viewers, this is Dr. Kishore Kumar, Assistant Professor in the Department of Biotechnology, SRR Government Arts and Science College, Karimnagar, Telangana State. As we all know that now the whole world is facing the health crisis because of COVID-19 virus. So hundreds of scientists around the globe, they are working to get vaccine and medicine for the treatment of the COVID-19. In this scenario, you just assume that this is what the life science importance is. So, as being in a biotechnology faculty, I am going to present here the few important topics which are important for the biotechnology students. So, some of the few important topics which are not only required for the life sciences, which each and everyone should understand what is the importance of these fundamental concepts to the humans. So, now we all know that this is whole education system has been transformed to the digital mode. So, in this scenario, even we are trying to give a few fundamental basics of the biotechnology which are important for the each and every student. So in this background, I am going to teach you today's class that is related with the biomolecules. Yeah, right viewers. So as I mentioned, now we are going to discuss about the very basic concepts of the cell. So you just imagine that any kind of the life, or if we want to define a life, so definitely that can be defined in a sense of or in the scenario of living cells, right? So in a scenario of living cells. So whether you might have get a doubt that what is mean by living cells? Is there any dead cells that can be present in the nature? Yes, students, this is we should understand that there will be two different type of cells that can be existed in in a perspective of living nature. We call them as living cells, non-living cells, or dead cells. So if you take the living cells are nothing but the cells which can perform the metabolic activities. So if a cell that is performing the metabolic activities, then we can call them as these cells are living cells. So the other kind of the cells is nothing but these cells will not perform any kind of the metabolic activities. So if you take the living cells, so living cells should have a metabolic activity mean definitely that cell should require the basic molecules. So these cell required basic molecule, we call them as biomolecules, as I shown here. So these we call them as a biomolecules. So these biomolecules which are to be important for each and every living cell. The name itself indicates, you just see here, these are the molecules that can be present in the biological system. So molecules mean, as this is to be a simple chemistry, we call them as biochemistry. So this simple chemistry which is essential to get any cell to become a living nature, right? So these molecules present in a biological system, we call them as a biomolecules. There are many simple terminology that can be present in these biomolecules. So few of them which I have written here, you can see we also call them as a molecules of the cell. All right. Then some people or some text will also be called them as these are the raw materials for the cell. This is very important. Why they are calling as a raw material? Because of this raw material only the cell will get in a activity that we call them as a metabolic activity. So even some people will also call them as a building blocks of life. This is very important, right? So when we are defining the life, definitely the cell has to be perform the metabolic activities. These metabolic activities definitely will be important for the biomolecules to the cell, right? So now today we are going to discuss about the few basic important points of these biomolecules. Now few basic important molecules. So you just see this biomolecules. If you take this how many different type of biomolecules that can be present in a cell, that I am going to discuss here, and their basic functions and basic structures and their basic nature. So if you see all biomolecules always will have an organic nature. So this is like a simple chemistry as I explained. So organic molecules. So if there will be an organic molecule, you should understand that this is to be contain carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen and oxygen. Any kind of the biomolecule, this biomolecule should require 4 different kinds of the elements. So these 4 different kinds of the elements, we call them as very important things. So these are nothing but carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen and oxygen. So this is the basic composition of any kind of the biomolecules that is existing in the living cells. So one more important phenomena on this biomolecules is these are all polymers. So polymers mean you just understand that polymers mean these are to be an big compounds or big molecules. We call them as an macromolecules. So why these are to be an macromolecule and what are those specific functions of these polymers, we are going to see each and every respective biomolecules chapter. Then as I explained that these are all the organic compounds. You should be remember. These are all the organic compounds, and these organic compounds are important for the living cells, and they make up of all living organisms. The best example which I have given is glucose. Not only the science students, each and every student should be know about this molecule that is called glucose. So this is what the importance of the biomolecule. So now coming to the biomolecules, how many different kinds of the biomolecules that can be present in a cell. So this as I given here, the life depends on total 4 different kinds of the organic molecules. We should remember this, right? So without these 4 molecules, there is no life possible to the cells, right? First one is to be carbohydrates, second one is to be lipids, third one is to be proteins, and the last one is to be nucleic acids, right? Total how many biomolecules are important? Total 4 different kinds of the biomolecules that should be important for the any cell that has to be perform the many metabolic activities, right? It's clear then. So now, but these are to be on different kinds of the biomolecules. The monomers, you can see these are the monomers to be polymers to be on many different kinds of the complex molecules as I showed in this diagram. But anyway, don't worry about these structures. I'll explain in a very simple manner when we are going into their respective macromolecules. And coming to the functions. So if you see why these biomolecules are important. So these biomolecules are important because these should have a different kinds of the functions in a cell. So you might have think that all these four different kinds of the biomolecules will not have the same kind of function in a cell, right? So each and every specific biomolecule will have a special kind of role in the cell, right? Those we generally call them as in functions. So you can see here, this is first one, as I explained, this is carbohydrates. Carbohydrates, the prime function, we call them as the first function of carbohydrate to the cell is the simple thing which is important, energy. So this is a very fundamental requirement of any living cell. So what do you mean by energy? So energy mean, which is a very simple, the living cell has to be perform many different kinds of the metabolic activities. These many different kinds of the metabolic activities should require the energy. That energy we call them as an ATP. This is very clear, right? ATP. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. This adenosine triphosphate, we also call them as an cellular currency. So this ATP is act as an energy. This energy is required for the various metabolic processes that is to be happening into the cells, right? That is the primary function of the carbohydrates. And not only the energy, there will be other functions that can also be present to the carbohydrates. So you can see here, this is to be support and recognition. So the support and recognition, that is nothing but one cell has to be communicate to the other cell. So this cell to cell communication should require, there will be some physical materials which can be connected from one side of the cell to the other side of the cell. So that we call them as an cellular or physical barriers or physical connectors. These physical connectors we call them as an lectins, right? These are to be many different kinds of the recognition molecules that can be present. And the important thing is these recognition molecules. So if you take humans, we are all eukaryotic. So human cells will have only the plasma membrane. This plasma membrane will have this cellular recognition particles. These are all made up of from the major principal part is to be on carbohydrates. That is to be on secondary level function of the carbohydrates. If you take the second biomolecule, that is called protein. The proteins, here you can see the proteins will have two different kinds of the functions to the cell. One is to be structural function, second one is to be cellular function. So the structural function and cellular function both are very important for different kinds of the biomolecules. So here you see the enzymes. So here the enzymes will be comes to the functional part of the cells. So as we are discussing, the cell has to be perform many metabolic activities. These metabolic activities should require the enzymes. So this we call them as a functional part of the proteins. And this is a tagline that can be given to the enzymes, that all enzymes are proteins, but all proteins are not or need not to be an enzymes, right? So this is like all Sundays are holidays, but all holidays are not Sundays. But anyway, I am going to discuss about the what are the enzymes and how they done for the functional role to the cells. Not only this, the secondary part of these proteins should have the transport pigments and various functions. The structural part, and recognition part and transport pigments and signaling molecules and even movement proteins, example myosin. So these are all many different kinds of the structural role has to be done with the help of proteins by the cells. Then coming to the third biomolecule, that we call them as an lipids. So here lipids in simple form we call them as an fats. So does fat will have any kind of role to the cell? Because nowadays everyone is speaking about the fats are very bad to the cells. So these are very bad to the human system. So this is not exactly true. Why? Because lipids are fats. This is one of the major biomolecule among these four, because these lipids will have a special kind of the roles that only the lipids can do, not other biomolecules. Here example I have given here the cell membrane structure. Cell membrane structure, which is very important. Cell membrane mean if you take the plasma membrane should have various kinds of the proteins, carbohydrates and lipid molecule that can be present. We call them as a lipid bilayer structure, which is to be very important, and we will discuss at appropriate time how the lipid bilayer should be present and how it is to be formed and what is the importance of each and every a component that is to be required for the forming of these biomolecules. Not only that forming of these cellular membranes, these are also important for the cellular signals. So cellular signals are nothing but these are to be, we call them as an cell signaling. So cell signaling mean the cell has to be understand what is happening in and around, that we generally call them as an external environment. So if the cell knows the external environment only, according to that the cell has to be modify, or cell has to be synthesize different kinds of the proteins to adapt to the external environment situations. So these are all, we call them as an cellular signaling or cell signaling, which is to be a very beautiful and fundamental phenomena that anyway we will discuss in the upcoming classes. And not only that, one of the very important function of these lipids is if you take the vitamins, right? So vitamins, which are to be very important, are very essential for the many different kinds of the roles of cellular functions. So here if you take the vitamins will be basically divided into two categories. One is to be on water soluble vitamins. Our second category will be the fat soluble vitamins. So water soluble vitamin, the best example I have given is B complex vitamins, and fat soluble vitamins, the example is vitamin A, vitamin D and vitamin K. Here I have given one example, that is vitamin K. So not only K, A, D, K, these are the three vitamins that should be stored in the lipids, which is very important. If the lipid content, or if the fatty acid content, or if the fats content is low in your system, definitely that is going to be affect the storing capacities of A, D, K vitamins, right? So this is to be very important. And lastly, coming to the last biomolecule, this we call them as an nucleic acids, right? So the nucleic acids, the prime function of nucleic acid is simple. These are to be hereditary molecules. As a human, we should say that our cell will have the DNA. This DNA will have the genetic material, and that is to be important for the hereditary character, and that can be transferred from one generation to the next generations, right? So, and not only the hereditary function, and which is also be important for the protein making information. So the protein making information, this we generally explain with the help of RNA. So RNA in a humans you take RNA will not have any kind of hereditary function. RNA is only having for the information which is related with the synthesis of proteins. So as you discussed now, the coronavirus, which will be the main hereditary point of the coronavirus is to be RNA. So this RNA, which is to be highly unstable. So RNA is to be unstable. So unstable RNA, if it is present as an or if it is act as an hereditary material, so that can going to be mutate. Mutation will leads to many different kinds of the proteins and which will have a different kinds of the role. That's what the making of a vaccine for the coronavirus will be a little challenging task, because where the RNA will act as an hereditary material. So not only that, and the other functions all we call them as an energy. So obviously energy, which I explained here, the carbohydrates, energy in a form we call them as an ATP. ATP is nothing but that is to be adenosine triphosphate adenosine, which is adenine. This is one kind of the nucleic acid, and the detailed structures and everything we will see in the upcoming chapters. And even these nucleic acid will also act as a signaling. So these are, we call them as in secondary signaling molecules. So if we are saying like this is to be a secondary signaling molecule, definitely there will be a primary signaling molecule that can be present. So that all which are related with a very advanced and sophisticated science, we call them as an cell signaling, where we will discuss how what are the primary signals and what are the secondary signals and what are their major roles that is to be important for this kind of things, right? So as you clear this, so these four different kinds of the biomolecule will have a different kinds of the role in a cells, right? So this is clear now. So you just remember the basic functions of these biomolecules to the cells. This is to be very important. And if you see the structures, actually, so we call them as these are to be carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and these are the elements, essential elements which will make to these biomolecules, as I explained in the first slide. And if you're going into these structures, so structures, as I explained, that these are to be on polymers. Polymers mean we call them as these are to be on big molecules. If you take the carbohydrates, carbohydrates generally that can be existing in the polysaccharide nature. These polysaccharides, if you're going into we are going into the simplest carbohydrate, we call them as a simple sugars. So what are these simple sugars? Everything we will understand it, right? Why we are calling it as a saccharide? So saccharide is another name that can be given to the carbohydrates, or the simple name is sugars. So why it is to be sugars, we will see the respective carbohydrate chapter. And coming to the proteins, these proteins will be made up of amino acids. These amino acids, if you take any living cell, 20 different kinds of the amino acid that can be present. These 20 different kinds of amino acid will making into being different kinds of the proteins, and which will have the many structural as well as functional roles, as we discussed in a previous slide. And coming to the lipids, so these lipids, especially the simple form of lipids, we call them as glycerols, right, and fatty acids, right? So these are to be a simple molecule from which it is to be making into be polymers. That part also we will see in the respective lipids. And then final one is nucleic acid. The nucleic acid, the simple part, we call them as nucleotides, right? So nucleotides will become the nucleotides will be made up of from the nucleosides with phosphates, and these nucleotides will form the polynucleotides, and the polynucleotides will form the chains, and both the chains will form the DNAs, and all these information which I am going to clearly give you in a respective chapters. So this is to be very simple, right? So all are polymers. This is very clear. All biomolecules are polymers. These biomolecule polymers, and polymers mean there should be an simple units that should be present. That simple units we call them as an monomers, right? The simple units we call them as an monomers. Example here I have given cellulose. You take which is a very big carbohydrate molecule. We call them as an polysaccharide. So the cellulose will be made up of glucose. Glucose is, we call them as a monomer. And if you take the amino acids, this is made up of 20 different kinds of the 20 different kinds of amino acid will be made up of proteins. And here the fatty acid and glycerol will be important for the made up of the lipids. So made up of the lipids. So here we are, so far we discussed about what are the different essential factors which will be important for the cellular functions. So biomolecule, you should remember only the home take points are only 4. You should remember that. First one, 4 different kinds of the biomolecules that should be present. One is carbohydrate, second one is proteins, third one is to be lipids, fourth one is to be nucleic acid. That is the first point. And second point, you should remember that these biomolecules should have a various functions. If you take carbohydrates, important for the energy formation. If you take nucleic acid, these are important for the hereditary function. If you take lipids, these are important for the cellular signaling and the storage of vitamins. If you take the proteins, proteins will have a structural and functional role. That is the second point, you should remember that. And third point is, unless you study these biomolecules, we can't understand whole part of the cells. So whenever we want to understand the complete picture of the cell, that we generally call them as an metabolic activity. Any cell metabolic activity that can be understood with the help of these biomolecules. And you should remember that the last point is, these are all organomolecules and will have a polymers. So that can be made up of monomers. So with this basic introduction, I'm going to stop here, and we will see each and every biomolecule in the upcoming videos. And thank you so much.